This episode of The Dig is brought to you by our listeners who support us at patreon.com and by Polity Press, which has loads of great titles, perfect for Dig listeners like you. One that you might like is The End of Sovereignty by Antonio Negri, translated by Ed Emery. The End of Sovereignty is the second volume in a new trilogy by the Marxist theorist Antonio Negri. A follow-up to his book Marx in Movement, Negri develops and defends his view of the modern state as a despotic and oppressive power. In contrast to those on the left who accept the state as inevitable, Negri makes the case that we need to be done with the sovereign state imposed on us by the capitalist organization and bourgeois society, which he argues has become a weapon in the hands of a declining ruling class. Abolishing the state, in Negri's view, is the utopian core of a radical politics of liberation. The End of Sovereignty by Antonio Negri, out now from Polity Press. Learn more at politybooks.com. Welcome to The Dig, a podcast from Jacobin Magazine. My name is Daniel Denver, and I'm broadcasting from Providence, Rhode Island. This is episode 3 of our 4-part series on the history of modern Iran, with Eskandar Sadeghi-Boroujerdi and Golnar Nikpour. We pick up where the last episode left off, in the wake of the U.S.-British orchestrated 1953 coup against Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh, a coup carried out because Iran had dared to nationalize the Anglo-Iranian oil company. The result was the reinstallation of Mohammad Reza Shah as dictator in all but name. The Shah picked up where he had left off, this time with his nationalist opponents in the National Front and communist opponents in Tudeh crushed. Back in power, the Shah intensified the construction of a more profoundly authoritarian and repressive regime, a regime that would be a key pillar of U.S. power in the region. That intensified repression, however, was complemented by a grand attempt at manufacturing consent, which accelerated in 1963 with the launching of the Shah's White Revolution, intended to be a revolution from above that would preempt revolution from below and bind Iranians to the regime and to the person of the Shah. The White Revolution included mass literacy campaigns and, also critically, land reform. But the contradictions of the White Revolution, particularly of land reform, ultimately laid the groundwork for the Islamic Revolution that would overthrow the Shah in 1979. While many peasants did receive small holdings, many more did not, and millions of newly proletarianized peasants filled peripheral slums on the outskirts of cities like Tehran. The Shah's attempt to preempt rural revolution would, ironically, create the conditions for an urban revolution that would end his rule and install Khomeini as supreme leader. As peaceful efforts to reform the Shah's regime were repressed over the years, dissident politics radicalized, a dissidence that encompassed a wildly diverse set of political actors, from armed leftist movements and new political syntheses of Shi'ism and socialist third worldism to Islamists rallying around the radical cleric Ruhollah Khomeini. They were united in their opposition to the Shah, who they brought down in the Islamic Revolution in 1979. And that revolution, in all of its complexity, is where we end this third episode. But the opposition, united against the Shah, was divided on much else. By 1979, the Shah had brutally repressed the left. The clergy were repressed too, but nowhere near as brutally. Their seminaries, mosques, and religious networks remained intact. After mass protests ousted the Shah, a period of uncertainty and openness followed under the Provisional Islamic Revolutionary Government. But Khomeini quickly consolidated power, creating a system known as the guardianship of the Islamic jurist that would place unelected clerics above democratically elected leaders, with Khomeini sitting at the very top. Mandatory head coverings for women were steadily imposed, replacing the Shah's authoritarian, but in some notable respects modernizing, state feminism with a new Islamist regime of gendered social control, legality, and segregation. We'll pick up soon in our fourth and last episode of this series, in the aftermath of the revolution, when Khomeini's Islamists bloodily repressed the radical left and confronted Saddam Hussein's invasion from Iraq, and then take us all the way to the present moment of crisis. One note on a name that comes up in the interview that might require a little more context. Ali Amini, a former member of Mossadegh's cabinet who had resigned in July 1952. He would go on to serve as prime minister under the Shah from 1961 to 62 and as Iran's ambassador to the U.S. The key significance of Amini's time as prime minister was that it was a moment of brief and relatively mild political opening, one that the Shah quickly put an end to, and which was followed by the White Revolution and increasingly brazen concentrations of power that were characterized by many observers as megalomaniacal. Okay, before I ask you to support this podcast financially, I'd like to ask you to support it rhetorically. Please rate and review us on iTunes. That helps more listeners find the podcast. And if you like this Iran series, please share it on Instagram, TikTok, or on Twitter before Musk kicks you off. But also, please do make a contribution at patreon.com/thedig to keep this podcast up and running strong. I'm sure I'm missing something out there, but no other podcast that I know of keeps itself running as a full-time operation through voluntary contributions. We pay well nothing, and we'll always keep it that way because we want everyone to listen, regardless of your ability to pay. That is really important to the political mission of the podcast, which is the primary reason I do this podcast. But that said, we do have to keep the lights on. We will also send you our weekly newsletter for a contribution of any amount, and we'll send you a book or books in the mail, or a Dig tote bag or a Dig mug, fine-looking merch, for a contribution of $10 or more a month. If you can afford to contribute, make a contribution now at patreon.com/thedig. That's patreon.com/thedig. The link is in the show notes. Okay, here's part 3 of my interview with Eskandar Sadeghi-Boroujerdi and Golnar Nikpour. Watch our podcast feed for the last episode in our 4-part series on modern Iran. We'll be putting it out sometime in the next week. Eskandar Sadeghi-Boroujerdi is a professor of contemporary politics and modern history of the Middle East at Goldsmiths College, University of London. He is the author of Revolution and Its Discontents, Political Thought and Reform in Iran, associate editor of the journal Politics, and co-edits Radical Histories of the Middle East. Golnar Nikpour is a professor of history at Dartmouth College with an interest in histories of law, incarceration, and rights in modern Iran. She is currently finishing her first book project, A History of Iranian Prisons and Carcerality in a Global Context, is on the editorial collective for the journal Radical History Review, and co-edits Radical Histories of the Middle East. We closed out the last episode discussing the 1953 U.S.-British joint coup against Mohammad Mossadegh, which reinstalled the Shah, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi. How did the Shah move to consolidate power in the coup's wake? And specifically, how did he go about increasing the size, power, and also reach of the military and domestic policing forces, including secret policing forces? And then, in what ways did Mohammad Reza Shah's state repressive apparatus building project, in what ways did that relate to or build off the one undertaken by his deposed father?
So following the coup, obviously, Mossadegh is arrested. He is put on trial. He is obviously unrepentant. And this obviously just further kind of elevates him and sort of transforms him into the nationalist icon, an anti-colonial icon that he already was, but this really sort of enshrines him. And then he is placed under house arrest in Ahmadabad, a village of his village, until 1969, when he dies. But in the immediate aftermath of the coup, General Zahedi comes to power. He becomes the prime minister. Very, very quickly, the Eisenhower administration moves to stabilize the government, which obviously had been cut off from oil revenues because of basically this naval blockade. It becomes the immediate recipient of emergency aid. And rather quickly, and again, I think a lot of this was down to Cold War considerations because the Eisenhower administration and the Dulles brothers were quite concerned about the instability of the regime. So very quickly, they sort of pressure the oil majors to conclude a consortium agreement in 1954 and a 50-50 sort of oil profit sharing agreement that was already seen in the cases of Saudi Arabia and Venezuela and so on. But basically management and production would be firmly in control of the oil company. So there was, in a sense, this quite nominal acknowledgement that the oil industry belonged to Iran, but really control and production were very much in the hands of the oil companies.
And just to emphasize, this is just after the Dulles brothers had orchestrated a coup against Mossadegh for daring to nationalize the Anglo-Iranian oil company. Now they're kind of being like, well, you know, here's some nominal recognition of your claims to your own oil.
Exactly. I mean, they had recognized the power of Iranian nationalism. So again, it was sort of the symbolic acknowledgement, but real power lied elsewhere. But then very quickly, and part of this strategy, they moved to obviously consolidate a very sort of build up a repressive security apparatus in the form of the Savak, which I think, Golnar maybe can speak to in more detail.
Yeah, so Eskandar mentions a lot of the immediate moves to consolidate and sort of stabilize the Shah's government and to immediately sort of disempower and arrest members of the National Front. This wouldn't be all. And of course, the most, I think, famous, or maybe infamous is the better word, government organization that comes out of the post-coup restructuring is the Shah's new intelligence service, which is called SAVAK. The SAVAK is an acronym for the سازمان اطلاعات و امنیت کشور, which is essentially the intelligence and security organization of the country. So that is formally founded in 1957 under the direct supervision of the CIA and with help from Israeli Mossad. Eventually, SAVAK grows to being an enormously feared secret police force and has, by the time of the revolution, something like 5,000 agents, like official agents, but untold numbers of informal informants. SAVAK becomes enormously feared throughout society. I mean, I could tell you some of the statistics, but I think in some ways, thinking about SAVAK more as the sentiment that it produces among ordinary Iranians is just as telling, right? So there is a sense that builds and builds over the next 20 years that you are being surveilled at all times at your place of work. There might be, people that you might know, even your own family member might be a SAVAK informant. So the idea that the SAVAK represents the eyes and ears of the Shah and has wormed its way into the nooks and crannies of all sort of civil life across the country. And not only in the country, because SAVAK is also responsible for an enormous amount of repressive policing outside of the country, policing dissidents in Europe and the United States in ways that are sometimes quite scary. It's also, of course, it's not only an internal sort of repressive apparatus, it also functions as a kind of external paramilitary type force in regional contexts. So it has quite a widespread application. But I should just mention, a little bit more about where the organization comes from. Again, as I said, it is trained by the CIA and by Israeli Mossad. U.S. Army colonel initially working with the CIA starts as early as 1953 to work with General Teimour Bakhtiar, who's the military governor of Tehran. They're founding the sort of nucleus of this new intelligence operation. Now, there had been intelligence police before 1953, but this was a new and more intensive operation. Eventually, in 1955, the person who is sent from the U.S. to be kind of in charge of training SAVAK personnel is Norman Schwarzkopf, General Norman Schwarzkopf, who...
Stormin' Norman.
Yeah, Stormin Norman, a person I think well known to those who have a sort of sense of late 20th century American military history. Under Schwarzkopf, the U.S. trains the first couple of generations of Savak agents. It's really not until about a decade later that Savak starts training its own personnel, but it has been trained enough by U.S. personnel to then be in charge of its own training. I also want to mention something that's a little bit less well-known than Savak. I think Savak is, among Iranians at least, absolutely a household term, regardless of one's political persuasion. Like, everyone knows what Savak is. But Savak is not the only policing force that is trained and, in fact, funded by the U.S. at this time. In 1959, the U.S. Army sent another mission to Iran, led by a less well-known figure by the name of Colonel Charles McLean Peake. And Peake is charged with reforming and training the Imperial Gendarmerie and also the Iranian National Police Force, and also sort of restructuring the prison system to some extent. And he doesn't work directly in prisons, but he's working with the police and security figures who are working in prisons, right? So it's kind of a wholesale new approach to policing and intelligence. So Savak is on the intelligence side. Peake is working with sort of civilian police, but also the gendarmerie. And he's training specifically what they're working on, funding and training, is riot control in the provinces and across the country. So whereas Savak is well known in part because the people that they're policing are intellectuals, dissidents, activists who write about their experiences with Savak, and that kind of leads to a broad kind of cultural understanding of Savak being in every cultural and political and civic space. But there's also, as I said, this big sort of push to train all of the different armed forces in Iran in these new forms of crowd management is the euphemism they use, but it's essentially riot control for when there are protests. This is something that I write about in my work, is that, interestingly, what Peake is talking about and what the Iranian police start talking about in this time is that these are more humane methods of policing and interrogation, and they're doing all of these new sort of more progressive, humane forms of policing and incarceration. So they're using a language of reform across the board in prisons and policing structures. They're starting to use the language of reform, but it's entirely towards sort of repressing social forces that are considered dangerous to the Shah. I should also note that Savak goes into labor unions, is very much sort of inserting itself into labor unions. Now, remember, in the pre-coup moment, there are these huge strikes, and the Tudeh party had worked to organize certain industries, but even beyond that, there were a number of industrial strikes. Well, in the aftermath of the coup, the Shah continues to use the 1931 anti-communist law to further crush the Tudeh, but Savak also creates new labor organizations through the labor ministry that are meant to sort of disallow the forms of labor organizing that had existed in the decade and a half prior. So we see this with this total crash in numbers of how many strikes there are. If there are, dozens of strikes in the early years of the 50s and late 40s, by 55 to 57, even before the formal sort of founding of Savak, there is a radical decline in the number of strikes that's happening. And that has to do with the new intelligence, this kind of nascent intelligence service going into the labor ministry and forming these new ways of minimizing labor organizing across the country. So we see all of these different forms of repression at the same time. And the vast expansion of the police forces as well. So again, we tend to exceptionalize Savak in some ways, and it is extremely important to talk about. But even the sort of so-called ordinary forms of policing become very intensively about controlling social connections between Iranians.
The Shah's rule was obviously a dictatorship, but I imagine that he didn't advertise it as such. What sort of nominal democratic rights and powers remained under the Shah? How did the state and government actually function? And what were people's supposed and then actual rights vis-a-vis that state?
Yeah, that's a terrific question. And I think actually it's important to note here that the Shah's approach and even his rhetoric shifts from the post-coup period through the 50s, 60s, and up to, the sort of lead up to the revolution. What I mean is that if we think of the height of the Shah's sort of authoritarian tendencies being manifested in the creation of basically enforced one-party rule in the mid-1970s in Iran, where this sort of nominal two-party apparatus and kind of nominal ability to remain outside of the purview of politics crumbles, and the Shah is basically he's really feeling himself by that point. The repressive wing of the state has eliminated his enemies as far as he's concerned, and he is just feeling like on the world. He starts demanding to be called Arya Meh, light of the Aryans, and it's just a moment of, scholars sometimes call it megalomania. If that's how he's feeling by the mid-1970s, then 1953 is a totally different situation. And even leading up to the late 50s and early 60s, it's a different situation. I think you can see this in his writing, some of his writings in the 1960s. In 1961, he even writes at one point and says a couple of times that if the constitutional government becomes strong enough, and if the reforms he's invested in undertaking become strong enough, he wouldn't oppose the eventual sort of receding or even dissolution of the role of the Shah. Now, I think it's debatable at best if he meant it. I mean, I don't think we can assume that he was really feeling like, my role here is to bring democratic governance and true constitutionalism to the country. On the contrary. But he's still speaking in terms of constitutional authority. He's still speaking in terms of the need for a sort of electoral system. And he's willing to, at least rhetorically, minimize his role at certain moments when he thinks it will benefit him. There's still technically the same constitution on the books as the one that had been won in the constitutional revolution in the early part of the 20th century. There's still a parliament, and there's this nominal kind of rule by constitutional monarchy. At the same time, all of this new sort of repressive state building is happening. The Shah and some of his closest advisors start thinking in terms of how they can build up some kind of affection for the Shah in ways that might mimic other nationalist leaders around the world, but leaders with anti-colonial bona fides. So there's in the archive all these records of the Shah's advisors, particularly an important figure by the name of Asadullah Alam, talking about the need to sort of create some sort of narrative around the Shah that will make him look more like a figure like Gamal Abdel Nasser of Egypt, or that kind of strong nationalist with some kind of anti-colonial bona fides, right? So there's a lot of different sort of things at work at this period. And there are a lot of different rhetorical strategies as well as deep sort of structural strategies for strengthening what in 1953 is ultimately an extremely unpopular and fragile government.
Like you just said, Golnar, the Shah, above all else, was trying to undermine what he saw as the key threats to his rule, the Tudeh and the National Front. And one response, as we were discussing, was repression. But another, as you just began to lay out, was the attempt to construct an image of the Shah as a more legitimate sort of nationalist leader, someone like Nasser. And a key part of this was the White Revolution, a form you mentioned to me earlier in a conversation prior to these interviews, Eskandar, a form perhaps of what Gramsci called passive revolution, that aimed to build a corporatist regime that would use massive oil revenues to modernize the economy and society in such a way that it would bind people to the state and thus preempt revolution from below. What was the Shah's program for building what he called a great civilization in Iran? And how did it simultaneously and seemingly pretty contradictorily draw on left-wing ideas while also being, above all else, a tool to preempt the left? And then lastly, How did these efforts to manufacture consent relate to that entire project of repressive institution building that we've been discussing?
So, I mean, as we saw in previous conversations that we've had, land reform has been a demand going all the way back to the beginning of the 20th century, and it was prominently made by social democrats and socialists of various hues. So this was very much a long-standing demand. It is one that has been articulated and re-articulated in different ways. And this, again, was very much more broadly a demand which we saw across the global south in predominantly sort of agrarian societies. But then when we sort of hit the beginning of the 1960s, I guess there were multiple things that happened. There's these long-standing grassroots and political mobilizations around land redistribution. So that's one thing which has been ongoing, and it's been a constant sort of challenge to the Shah and the Shah's legitimacy, and especially when we recall that his father appropriated huge amounts of land in Mazandaran, his home province. But there are also more, you could say, conventional politicians, people like Hassan Arsanjani, who was by no means anti-establishment, but modernizers, we could say, within the Iranian system, who very clearly understood or saw the condition of the peasant as an outrage. They saw it as actually really a condemnation of the status quo, and therefore were themselves also committed very much to a kind of reform agenda and trying to better the lot of the peasantry. And Hassan Arsanjani is just such an example. Another actually interesting sort of take on this, actually, so we spoke previously about Khalil Maliki, the socialist who had actually broken with the Tudeh party and then became a very, very harsh critic of both the Soviet Union and the Tudeh party, really probably you could say one of their sworn enemies of the Tudeh party. And one of the, I could say, ironies or something that actually happens in this period because of this disillusionment with the Tudeh party and the Soviet Union, people like Khalil Maliki and his brother, Hossein Malik, start looking to other ways in which agriculture had actually been socialized. And they actually start looking to the Israeli state and the kibbutz model.
Whoa.
Yes. Yes, as an alternative model. And they actually made trips there, as did Arsanjani, and they meet with Golda Meir and various other Israeli politicians. And they see this as actually a model to be imitated in the context of Iran. So this is just to give you an idea of sort of the broad sweep of discussions, both at more radical challenges from amongst the Tudeh party to more sort of reformist approaches, people like Hassan Arsanjani and people like Khalil Maliki, socialists. And similarly, at the same time, we have the coming to power of the Kennedy administration and the broader Cold War, the global Cold War context, and very much an awareness since, I guess, the Chinese Revolution that peasant insurgencies and sort of lack of reform, agrarian reform, posed a major political danger and could actually very much result in this sort of mass politicization of the peasantry and further cause destabilization. And very much it was sort of conditions that could be, ripe for exploitation by communist and left-wing forces. And again, this is ideologically very much aligned with, Walter Rostow's famous sort of concept of like modernization theory, the fact that all societies in the developing world had to undergo this very linear transformation from being sort of peasant agrarian societies to being sort of modern urban societies, very much modeled on 50s USA. Basically. So that was another sort of component to which obviously many of the Shah's sort of technocratic supporters or people very much who were part of the regime were very much on board with.
And this is the Kennedy administration's Alliance for Progress politics in Latin America.
Exactly, which we see a kind of iteration of that in the Iranian context. And this then leads to the arrival on the scene of Ali Amini, who was actually, I believe he's the grandson of Mozaffaruddin Shah, the Shah who famously signed the constitution. So very much an establishment politician. He was actually in the post-coup government as well. He was the Minister of Economic Affairs. And he was also a former ambassador to the United States in Washington. So very much an establishment figure, but he was seen as a modernizing figure within the regime. He was seen as the United States' kind of chosen candidate. Comments from the Shah very much show that the Shah saw him as such. And because the Shah, to some extent, was facing challenges from elsewhere and various fronts, he sort of gives this sort of experiment of an internal modernizer, as it were, a chance. And Hassan Arsanjani, the person I was just speaking about, becomes the Minister of Agriculture in this and wants to pursue this sort of reform agenda, particularly, obviously, agrarian reform. And we haven't obviously reached the White Revolution yet, but it sort of lays the ground for the White Revolution, because in the Amenei period, which is very brief, it's from 1961 to 1962, just about a year, just under a year maybe. And under that government, we do see the re-emergence of the National Front and the so-called Second National Front. And we see a huge rally in the Stadium Jalaliya of like 100,000 people in support of the National Front and and so this desire to see an opening on the political front in elections. Amenei, though, has his own plans. He sort of, I have to pursue certain reforms before we can sort of enter in the political conversation. At the same time, the National Front is trying to pressure him and saying, no, actually, we need to have all of this together in order for it to actually be meaningful in any sense. And ultimately, yes, the Amenei government becomes unstuck. The Shah sort of sweeps in and then really co-opts this agenda, really. But then also he defangs and actually many of maybe the more radical elements of it. And then obviously, as we can maybe speak in terms of his execution, it actually ends up sowing the seeds of his demise in certain ways, you could argue. So, I mean, when the Shah sort of takes charge of the White Revolution, it very much becomes his agenda. He's sort of presenting himself as a quote-unquote revolutionary monarch. This is, again, goes back to what Golnar was saying about trying to present himself as a nationalist leader, as someone sort of in the age of this sort of global Cold War who can compete with the Nassers, obviously the Ho Chi Minhs and all these sorts of things. And he's trying to kind of co-opt that while obviously reconstitute, recalibrate, reconfigure his power and sort of forge this new corporatist kind of order. We're still quite a way off of that. But obviously it's the White Revolution because it's opposed to any idea of a Red Revolution. I think that needs to be really, really clear. And as I said, it's about neutralizing any kind of threat from the peasantry. Actually, one of its sort of major objectives was to create a class of smallholder peasants that would really become a fulcrum of the regime. That was kind of the ambition, you could say, and is really what he aspired to. And apart from obviously land reform, there were various other things. There was the enfranchisement of women. They got the vote, but obviously in this sort of increasingly dictatorial system, the meaning of that vote became sort of, I guess, increasingly negligible. So that's obviously one thing. There were sort of commitments to increasing literacy. So there was something called the Sepah-e-Danesh. So actually sending the literacy corps, sending young people who maybe were doing their military service and whatnot into the countryside to try and educate villagers. There was even a version of it called the Sepah-e-Din. So like actually it was sort of propagating increasingly kind of a state-approved, state-sanctified version of religion and Islam. And I think it's important to actually note that the White Revolution was definitely a co-optation, a form of passive revolution, sort of making various concessions towards left-wing demands in order to reconstitute or sort of, in a sense, consolidate the Shah's grip and sort of, in a sense, double down on the more autocratic elements of the regime. But there were also elements such as the women's enfranchisement and also, for instance, in terms of court trials, people were allowed to swear on books or holy books other than the Quran. So there was this sort of dual element. So on the one hand, land reform seemingly had some positive consequences. So it did actually redistribute land to about, if I remember correctly, 1.6 million or so peasants. But the problem with it is that basically for every single family which received a viable plot of land which could be self-sustaining, 3 didn't. So basically what happened ultimately is that productivity actually declined after agriculture declined after the White Revolution. You see this sort of mass proletarianization simply because many of these peasants who were meant to become independent farmers just simply couldn't sustain their livelihood. They couldn't support their families. And so what you actually had was sort of massive sort of increases in impoverishment and deprivation in the countryside. And then, like I said, this influx of millions of peasants into sort of shanty towns in like the south of Tehran and other kind of major cities. And obviously this would become very significant at the time of the revolution because many of these individuals who sort of, this influx into the city end up becoming politicized and having a role in the overthrow of the Shah. So, the White Revolution has this kind of mixed balance sheet, and this is obviously speaks to its sort of its character as a form of passive revolution, which did actually, you could say, co-opt and did make certain concessions, did have certain, you could say, quote unquote, progressive elements, but actually proved very much corrosive to sort of both the Shah's what he had initially had envisioned, and obviously his grip on sort of development subsequently. So, yeah, it's a very kind of complex, I would say, multifaceted process.
Where specifically did the status of women in society fit into the Shah's political project? This combination of these gestures at economic modernization combined with making a performance of easing the hold of Islamist strictures on women reminds me a lot of MBS today, Mohammed bin Salman.
Yeah, that's a interesting comparison. I think for the Shah, at least initially, the question of women's enfranchisement is not the primary one that he is invested in when it comes to reform. He is very much thinking about land reform first, in large part because that's where the energy is on the part of the Amini government and the more radical demands for land reform that Eskandar laid out. The Shah is really, really keen on not only on being seen as a sort of progressive, enlightened, modern constitutional monarch, but in making sure he gets the credit for the reform. I mean, this is part of the frustration he has with the Amini government. Amini is using the language of the White Revolution in 61 and 62. He's using that phrase. He's talking about the need to sort of undercut what he calls reactionary forces, including the large landowners, some of whom are members of the ulama. So the Shah wants to come in and sort of make sure he's getting the credit for those reforms. And women's enfranchisement on some level has the same structure as does the other reforms of the White Revolution, where there are independent organized efforts in some cases on the part of independent women's organizations and sort of feminist or proto-feminist, depending on what language you think sort of fits these organizations more clearly. And the Shah and the government is keen to absorb that as well, absorb the sort of critiques that he's receiving, and also to defang the more radical demands that are being made. So at the time of the White Revolution, women's enfranchisement is added as one of the first 6 points. So in the first iteration of the White Revolution that the Shah makes, which he launches by decree, it's a 6-point program at first. By the time of the revolution, it had been expanded to 17 points. So every kind of reform is everything in the sort of statist, reformist imaginary is folded into the White Revolution. And women's enfranchisement is part of that. And again, it's this kind of, exactly as Eskandar sort of articulated with the left, it's part of this strange kind of push and pull between the Shah and the more radical demands that are coming from leftist organizations, from left nationalists, from anti-colonial nationalists, and from women's organizations for certain rights, including not only enfranchisement, but beginning in the late 19th and into the 20th century, there are organized women's movements demanding greater access to education, greater access to so all kinds of social betterment, right? And the White Revolution actually does have the effect of, in the absolute sense, improving all of these markers for things like overall literacy rates, overall sort of life expectancy rates, the life expectancy rates of pregnant women, infant mortality rates. In the overall sense, it improves a lot of these markers. Again, the question is the extent to which some of those demands are defanged and folded into a statist project. The figure that is most associated with the state feminism that comes out of the White Revolution period is the Shah's very powerful and sort of famous twin sister, Ashraf Pahlavi, who comes to sit on a number of women's rights and human rights organizations and delegations, both in the country and internationally. So she becomes the Iranian delegate working with the UN on issues of human rights and women's rights. She becomes a kind of international figure in some sense, promoting this vision of state feminism. I think this links in some ways to something else I wanted to emphasize about this period, which is we really have to understand the white revolution. I don't think it's enough to understand it. And I think Eskandar's response alludes to this as well. It's not enough to understand it simply as a matter of economic or social or political reform. It is those things. It is a very clear effort in line with some of the promoted concepts of the Kennedy administration to try to defang the possibility of a red revolution, again, a communist revolution, by sort of meeting some of the demands of the opposition. But it's also an effort to create a kind of myth history around the Shah, a kind of political culture around the Shah of a kind of enlightened, modern, nationalist monarchy. So to try to fuse the idea of monarchy and modernization, that Pahlavism is precisely a modern form of political structure. And what he starts calling the Great Civilization is a utopian, sort of imperial nationalist, modernist imaginary, right? So there's an internal gaze that he's interested in, which is about sort of disempowering his internal opposition. But there's also an external gaze. He is feeling very pressured to show himself as an enlightened modern monarch. And women's rights comes very, very clearly in at that point, that it is outward facing on some level. And that's why he's sending Ashraf Pahlavi around. That's why, there's all of these sort of private archival remnants of the Shah's own profound misogyny. So he is not himself a feminist champion, nor does he particularly believe in women's rights, but it's part of this imperial imaginary. And I think the one last example I'll give of that is in 1967, the Shah holds a coronation ceremony for himself. And this is, 24 years after he had ascended to power, but he's not strong enough, he feels, in 1953 to do such a thing, so he does it in 1967. And for the first time in Iranian history, the empress is also crowned Shah Banu. So empress, queen, however you want to sort of best translate that. And this is kind of, he makes this big visible external push to show just how enlightened his rule is. He says that if he is to die before the crown prince turns 20, that his wife will become queen, which would have been unprecedented. And this is all part of presenting himself as a kind of enlightened modern ruler in line with global norms, in line with sort of liberal norms, but it's always hedged, right? There's always some hedges in these proclamations. So I think that kind of gives a shape to where the Shah is at in terms of the question of gender more directly.
He's like, my wife is a girl boss.
Yeah, exactly. But only like in a very specific, limited, way. He uses the Empress Farah Pahlavi at these certain key crisis moments to show something like, as the revolutionary sort of uprisings are increasing in fervor, he, undertakes to send the Empress on pilgrimage to Karbala to sort of show off their Shia bona fides. So again, this is part of, for him, Ashraf and Farah are able to sort of be his proxies in these spaces. Although Ashraf is a little bit more of a wild card. She has a very strong personality.
Well, he has that famous interview with Oriana Fallaci where she asks him something along the lines of, do you think women can, are women equal to men in your estimation, and these sorts of things in terms of their accomplishments? And he says, women haven't even produced a kind of a great chef. Or when similarly he's asked in an interview with a US media outlet, alongside Farah Diba, his third wife, do you think women can lead? And he in essence refuses to answer, and he sort of looks to the interview that you're sort of making me feel very uncomfortable alongside my wife. And then his wife is sort of sitting there, kind of squirming almost, and then has to say, I don't think you really believe that. And then they sort of move on. It's this very uncomfortable kind of conversation. But I just wanted to, just stress something, because I think this is actually just I think the key to understanding the quote unquote reforms which the Shah pursued is that, so whether it's with women or whether it's actually with sort of the various kind of bursaries they would give to students to actually go abroad, it was basically everybody had to ultimately serve within the grand design of his project. It was all ultimately about just reconstituting this vertical relationship, this sort of corporatist relationship of some description where people sort of served a different function, within the ruling system. So obviously, he definitely did not expect, students to be engineering students who were then sent to Berkeley to study, to come back as Maoists who are then going to completely, call his rule into question. And on the one hand, with the case of women, it's a similar thing. On the one hand, he was co-opting the sort of long history of struggles by independent women's organizations. Many were on the left, liberals, and so on. But he certainly, he didn't expect women to challenge his rule. Mm-hmm. And like you said, and I think as Golnar was saying, there was it was about portraying and depicting Iran as, a modernizing, on the way to progress. And it's a strange hybrid between, I think, again, we spoke about this a bit last week, sort of this Janus face of nationalism, in the way sort of reconstituting his authoritarian rule, looking towards the future and Iran as being, this sort of Japan of the Middle East, but very much under ultimately his rule, his imprimatur, and a sort of a kind of authoritarian, monarchical system, and then drawing on all of these sort of imperial myths, which obviously then culminate in the famous 1971 sort of commemoration of quote unquote 2,500 years of Iranian monarchy, and this sort of lavish party as a kind of a testament to his rule, and sort of trying to get international recognition, legitimacy through basically putting on this huge kind of glorified circus. And again, which caused a lot of indignation. And I would say a lot of this also just comes from, one is the sort of, you have to remember, there's from 1953, there is a fundamental legitimacy deficit. This is a Shah who, is widely thought and is widely perceived to owe his throne to foreign intelligence agencies. And this is kind of, in a sense, a challenge which he's constantly trying to overcome and compensate for. And he's almost sort of, cosplaying this kind of revolutionary monarch exactly because he feels so inadequate in this regard. And he's constantly something which is sort of hanging over his head, looming.
He's well aware in 1958 that the Iraqi monarchy is overthrown by anti-colonialists, right? So that's just before the White Revolution. He references it several times as the thing that could happen if the White Revolution doesn't take root. At least internally, he and his advisors are talking about. Yeah, I didn't mean to interrupt you, Essie.
No, that's fine. That's good. That's so good.
Yeah, I wanted to mention one thing about the ways in which there are all of these kinds of almost paradoxical positions taken by people, or vacillations between different discourses. On the one hand, the Shah is talking about revolution. On the other hand, he's talking about being this great monarch in a line of 2,500 monarchs. But there are a lot of ways in which the independent social organizations, political activism, opposition groups are putting pressure on the Shah, but not only the Shah, right? Even Khomeini, who at this time is not yet the figure he is going to become, in some of his speeches, we know that the ulama, all of the, enormous number of the ulama oppose land reform. Private property is considered inviolable in Islamic law, at least in many interpretations of it. And a lot of the ulama are large landowners. But in some of his most public-facing speeches, Khomeini doesn't emphasize his opposition to land reform. He emphasizes the sort of oppressive qualities of the Shah, his giving concessions to the West, his all of the things that are much more popularly disliked about him. And although he opposes very stringently the women's right to vote, when it comes down to it, by the time the revolution happens, that's no longer really on the table. There's at no point is there a serious effort to disenfranchise women at the time of the revolution. And I think that we see in this way that these political demands are actually much bigger than they're bigger than their movement, because at some point, the Shah convinces some members of the National Front, as the revolution is truly escalated kind of outside of his control, has convinced some of them to try to take some moderating positions, and some of the more moderate clergy take some moderating positions. But people's demands continue to be, they're still going out on the streets, they're still protesting. So some of the political demands that come out of this era, some of the political transformations that come out of this era, I think precisely are not able to be captured by the statist, corporatist rubric that the Shah assumes that they're going to be kept in. And the women's right to vote is one of those things that even the senior ulama don't really come back to. And similarly, Khomeini says, there's this referendum. The Shah holds a referendum on the White Revolution, and quite ridiculously, it comes back 99.99% in favor, right? Meanwhile, there's protests happening just a couple months later that are quite large. But Khomeini says that there's no such thing as a referendum in Islamic law, and it's un-Islamic. It's not a Sharia-based, and it doesn't count. But then when it comes to it, after the success of the revolution, the Islamic revolutionaries hold a referendum on the Islamic Republic. Do you want an Islamic Republic, which overwhelmingly wins the vote? So again, we see that there are these sort of political forms that have stickiness even beyond their initial application or their initial use as kind of tools in the hands of dictatorial monarchs. I think we talked a little bit about this too, about the political language of nationalism and kind of imperial and even racialist nationalism that the Qajars start to use, but really gets emphasized in the Pahlavi period. That is also something that extends far beyond the Qajars, and even after the Pahlavis, this kind of high imperial nationalist imaginary of Persian grandeur is kind of in the ether, and has a kind of stickiness beyond its use by any one government. And I wanted to emphasize all of those things too, because they are very much going to continue to circulate and kind of move forward as the revolutionary upheaval begins in the 1970s.
How did the shape of the political opposition change in the years after the coup, as the National Front was repressed time and again, and Islamist figures, including, of course, Ruhollah Khomeini, emerged to the fore?
Okay, so the Amini government is in many ways seen as marking this last hurrah for internal reform within, actually people from within the establishment actually trying to not merely modernize the regime, but actually open it up to a greater degree of political competition, democratic contestation, civil liberties, so on and so forth. So it's obviously in this period that the National Front, and from the Second National Front, has its kind of brief period in the sun. They are clamped down upon, they're arrested, their leadership very, very quickly. Then shortly after that, the Third National Front is declared, and it really only lasts for a couple of weeks. And that was an interesting experiment in itself, because it was this broad kind of coalition of different forces that kind of wanted to, or were calling for this political opening, but it also called for alliances with various organizations across civil society, so including unions and guilds and so on. So it was really trying to forge this very broad coalition, but it was completely snuffed out, repressed profoundly. And many of these activists, so people like Abul Hassan al-Bani Sadr, who were very active in the National Front, or people like Hassan al-Zia Zarifi, who then becomes one of the founders of the People's Fadayan guerrillas. And obviously Abul Hassan al-Bani Sadr becomes the first president of the Islamic Republic. Many of them become profoundly radicalized after this. Also, obviously, it's in this period that we see the emergence of Ayatollah Khomeini really coming to the, emerging onto the national scene for the first time. And Ayatollah Khomeini he came from a provincial background in the small town of Khomein. His father was killed by a provincial landlord when he was only several months old. He goes into the clergy as a teenager, a young teenager. He had ties to the Fadayan Islam, sort of this first sort of Islamist group which engaged in all sorts of assassinations and was calling for an Islamist state, but whose leadership was pretty much decapitated in 1955.
And that was sort of aligned with Mossadegh's nationalists, no?
They turn on Mossadegh, actually,
right,
because he wasn't willing to pursue the sort of Islamist agenda. But that's a whole other story. So Khomeini has his ties to the fact in Islam. However, these sort of Islamist inclinations are definitely not approved of by Ayatollah Hossein Boroujerdi, who is sort of the preeminent kind of Ayatollah, grand Ayatollah, we might say, of Iran, who was very much in the quietist mold and was also a teacher of Khomeini. And Khomeini himself was a very unusual cleric, actually, because he wasn't known for his learning, actually, of jurisprudence, but his main interests actually were on Islamic philosophy, Neoplatonic philosophy. So Avicenna and Mullah Sadra, and sort of leading sort of these sorts of figures, as well as he also wrote poetry. He actually used the name Hindi because he actually, at least one part of his family, his ancestors went back to Kashmir. So he wrote sort of, you could say, amorous poetry, enamored of God or enamored of whoever. So he was actually quite unusual in this respect. His interest in philosophy, as I said, an interest in mysticism, like a deep interest in Islam, which was actually quite frowned upon by the majority of the clergy at this time. So he was a very kind of a unique cleric. Even sort of reading newspapers was frowned upon. He actually used to, he was an avid listener of like BBC radio and things like this, and actually was quite, even listened to, later on like Radio Israel. He was following the news in Farsi, following the news of what was going on in the country. But anyway, so by the time we hit June 63, this is when he mounts his, very, very strong opposition to the Shah's regime. And then, first and foremost, he's centering sort of dependence on the United States, sort of what he sees as the Shah's being supine to the interests of foreign powers, and very much criticizing the Shah's, what he sees as despotism, forms of arbitrary authority, and any kind of an abandonment of any sort of pretense to be, the sort of the classic Islamic monarch. And it's in 1963, in June 1963, that he sort of gives his very famous speech, kind of warning the Shah, exhorting the Shah not to pursue this road. But also, and this is actually something which a number of socialists pointed to at the time, very critical of women being given the vote, very critical of the land reform. So even at this period, we see this kind of a kind of ambivalent kind of position in it, really. Because on the one hand, he's giving this very sort of stark opposition, very, and he was seen as very brave and courageous for so openly sort of challenging the Shah's authority, and obviously challenging, dependence on the United States, this sort of this tacit relationships or surreptitious relationships with the Israeli state, but at the same time being critical of these, the right revolution as a whole, and what was seen by some as actually quote unquote progressive reforms on the question of women and minorities and so on. He's arrested after this speech, and then there are huge protests in Qom, but other cities sort of outraged at this. And this is then finally put down by Asad al-Alam, who's prime minister and the Shah's childhood companion, and himself comes from a very landed family. And then he is released, and then he has another speech in 1964 where he sort of compares, this is where he sort of famously compares the Shah to the figure of the Umayyad Caliph Yazid, who in sort of Shia law is, one of the most infamous personalities, or perhaps the most infamous personality in sort of Shia sacred history, the same figure who actually put down and ultimately killed Imam Hussein, the grandson of the Prophet Muhammad, who Shias mourn every year. So, Khomeini taps into this religious symbolism here in order to compare the Shah to, really as a sort of, exemplary, the epitome of an oppressive, brutal, illegitimate leader.
A Sunni despot.
Yeah, this is the thing. We couldn't say Sunnism was formed as a kind of orthodoxy at this period, but it was kind of seen as sort of this family dynasty which had betrayed the legacy of the Prophet and had actually spilt the blood of the Prophet's family. And this was seen as just, absolutely egregious. So tapping into that immediately sort of taps into this reservoir of myth and symbolism and memory and all these sorts of things. And really it's it's very plainly proclaiming that the Shah is illegitimate, brutal and an oppressive leader. And again, he's arrested And ultimately, there's this decision of whether the regime, what sort of measures the regime ought to take. Should it jail him? Should it execute him? And so on. And senior clerics step in to recognize him actually as a source of emulation, sort of the preeminent, of the highest echelons of the Shia clergy. And he's sent into exile first to Turkey, and then he makes his way to Najaf. But it's important to actually understand that the sort of in June 63, and it's called the 15th of Khordad, that is the Persian month, that itself has been enshrined as kind of a key watershed in the Islamist historiography, and how basically subsequently the Islamic Republic would try and actually provide its own narrative of sort of the run-up to the revolution, 15th of Khordad, where Khomeini really comes, there's this uprising after Khomeini's arrest, that's sort of seen as this pivotal kind of moment. And it was, of course, an important moment, but their attribution of importance to it is because this is where Khomeini becomes this national figure. And he hadn't become this sort of unifying force. He would subsequently, there were actually significant debates within left-wing circles in Iran of how they ought to understand and orient towards the Islamist opposition, because many were of the mind that, yes, indeed, Khomeini's denunciation and bravery and courage in challenging the Shah on every single count, his very legitimacy, was extremely important. And clearly religion had this great mobilizing power and force. But many others also, both members of the National Front and people such like Khalil Maliki, who were part of the Third National Front, independent socialists, members of the Tudeh party as well, actually, did see a reactionary side and danger here as well, particularly over the question of land reform and this sort of long-standing relationship between landed interests and elements of the clergy, as well as the question of women's enfranchisement. But yeah, this is really where Khomeini becomes the quote-unquote leader of the revolution.
High oil prices were essential to funding the White Revolution. And of course, oil had for a long time been at the center of Iranian politics, including, of course, both Mossadegh's nationalist movement in Tudeh and the coup against Mossadegh because he had dared to nationalize the Anglo-Iranian oil company. And then even more recently, in recent years, it's been at the center of the conflict between the U.S. and Iran over the nuclear program, with the U.S. imposing major sanctions against the industry. Stepping back from a moment from the historical chronology, how did the Shah's regime fit into the global political economy of oil at that moment? Because, again, in 1953, oil nationalization had prompted the U.S. and Britain to launch the coup that brought the Shah to power. By 1960, the Shah's Iran was a founding member of OPEC.
So, no, of course. I mean, the Shah does emerge as a founding member of OPEC. And actually, we have over this period, so throughout then the 60s, we do see the Shah actually, in a sense, buying into what I was sort of rather facetiously calling his kind of cosplaying this sort of revolutionary nationalist sort of leader. And very much kind of this whole discourse of sovereign rights does become part of the kind of dominant lexicon of powers in the global south. So we do see the Shah actually pushing and particularly fighting, being quite frustrated about the amount of oil which is being produced, the oil quotas from the oil companies. So we do see a back and forth with the consortium and him quite frustrated and sending his courtiers to try and actually push for and negotiate for higher revenues. Because on the one hand, the Shah has this very lofty visions for his modernizing vision of how he wants to transform Iran and turn it into, the Japan of the Middle East and so on. But he's frustrated in terms of the amount of oil revenues which are coming in. They're not actually where he, as far as he's concerned, they need to be. And I think, playing this role in OPEC is him trying to basically assert have more of a say over questions such of this, of course, because the production of scarcity is an essential part of profiteering in sort of the global oil industry. And yeah, more than often than not, the oil companies weren't willing to actually to cede to the Shah's demands. But then, as he sort of manages to kind of claw more control, more autonomy, while very much at the same time being aligned with, you could say, US interests often and such. And we see this again in the OPEC crisis of 73, where Iran does not actually participate in the boycott. It's actually Arab states led by obviously King Faisal, Saudi Arabia, who play the signal role in that. But what Iran does actually, as a result of soaring oil prices, it profits immensely. And this is obviously then used for his developmentalist vision. We just see sort of this rapid process of development where per capita sort of income increases several fold in the space of like 15 to 20 years. So we do see this like remarkable period of growth, but it's also characterized by increased levels of inequality, as well as actually, as I've been saying, sort of this consolidation on the political front of actually trying to ever more sort of consolidate his autocracy. So the politics of oil is very, very much part of that and a major kind of facilitator of that as well.
And also corruption. I mean, the money that's coming in from increased oil revenues, there's just an enormous amount of evidence of widespread and massive corruption. And this becomes one of the major sort of touchstones for revolutionaries across the political gamut. It's one of the issues, along with the issue of torture and political repression and political incarceration, that really brings protesters and revolutionaries and dissidents across the political spectrum together, is this issue of corruption. And Eskandar mentions the fact that very definitively a lot of money does flow into these essentially sort of social and civic services. I mean, there's some ups and downs in the early 70s, but by 1977 or so, the unemployment in the country is virtually negligible. And a lot of this has to do with the development projects that are promoted by the government. I mean, the projects are enormous and they bring in a lot of revenue for ordinary Iranians. But a lot of the money is clearly flowing into the Pahlavi family coffers and the Pahlavi Foundation. And this becomes one of the major sort of issues that brings protesters together, but also something that actually has weird reverberations into the revolutionary period too. When Khomeini becomes a kind of household name in the United States, which isn't, of course, until really the taking of the U.S. embassy and the hostage crisis. Like, yeah, of course, the revolution, some people might have heard more about Khomeini at that point, but he becomes a kind of widely known figure at the point of the hostage crisis. But people associate Khomeini with the oil pricing convulsions of the decade prior. So all across Wisconsin, for example, these billboards go up that remind drivers to drive 55 with huge, scary images of Khomeini next to them, kind of indicating that this person that we now know we hate for reasons having to do with the hostage crisis is somehow also behind escalating oil prices, and kind of conceptually linking these things in the minds of American citizens who don't really have much of a sense of who Khomeini is beyond these particular touchstones.
How did the contradictions of the Shah's regime, including those of the White Revolution, how did they ultimately undermine his regime's power rather than fortifying it, as I imagine he had intended? Eskandar, you mentioned, for example, that his land reform accelerated the mass proletarianization of peasants into peripheral urban slums, particularly like South Tehran, or sending students abroad to study engineering, turning them into revolutionary Maoists. Why did a project to bind the people to the regime and to the state backfire, creating multiple blocs increasingly alienated from and opposed to his rule? What were the key social blocs that turned against the regime, and why? Why did the Shah become unable to crush or co-opt dissent, and why did ultimately the Islamic Revolution break out when and how it did?
So I think to have a sense of why ultimately the Shah's government collapses and he's not able to sort of control the widespread dissatisfaction with his government in 1979, you have to go to a point that I alluded to a few years prior, when in fact things seem quite stable. I mean, until very, very late in the game, the global powers, the U.S. in particular, are calling Iran an island of stability. Very famously, Carter says Iran is an island of stability in otherwise troubled Middle East. So it's really, for many years, the Shah is thinking that his white revolution and his great civilization are in fact enormous successes. So the white revolution has the effect of really emphasizing these contradictions that come to be terminal for the government. I mean, Eskandar mentioned the mass urbanization and mass proletarianization of small farmers who are not able to sort of subsist on what the sort of agricultural production looks like in the aftermath of the White Revolution. Similarly, the other group of Iranians who are maybe the main beneficiaries of the White Revolution, namely the rising modern middle classes, people who are having their education subsidized, or there's a huge expansion of education at every level, like from the primary level to college level. This comes to backfire as well, because they're being sort of vertically interpolated into a project that's meant to sort of show and promote the wonderfulness of the Shah and the Pahlavi government, but they're not being allowed into the political system or into the sort of to participate in decision-making at a meaningful level whatsoever, right? So, the two political parties that exist before the one-party system, the Resurgence Party is founded in the mid-1970s. They're sort of jokingly called the Yes, Sir and the Yes, Of Course, Sir parties because they're not meaningful political parties. They're not allowed meaningful political opposition. And they're really, when it's decided which members of Majlis would belong to which party, they're basically appointed to membership of those parties by the Shah and by with help from Savak. So there's no meaningful way for the political opposition to become part of this broader governance structure. So there's an expansion of the state and an expansion of the bureaucracy and an expansion of all of these sort of middle class norms. Like into the 1960s, all of a sudden, millions of people have radios, hundreds of thousands of people, and then eventually millions of people have television sets. More and more people are reading newspapers. They're part of a kind of national and global public sphere, but they're not allowed to participate in political projects or in decision-making. So this produces another contradiction that eventually works to undermine the Shah. And as more and more people are becoming sort of part of this rising modern middle class, more and more people are both being educated in Iran and abroad, especially those Iranian students outside of the country, start in the aftermath of the White Revolution, and what eventually becomes quite an important part of the revolutionary coalition, an organization called the Confederation for Iranian Students. That organization alone gives you a sense of some of the shifts that happen politically. It starts out promoting an idea of constitutional monarchy and nationalism in the kind of Mossadegh model for the most part. And then eventually, within just a few years, is dominated by students who are calling for armed revolution. So in the aftermath, particularly of the White Revolution, when more and more Iranians are perceiving enormous income inequality, but also what is sometimes called by sociologists among the middle classes an expectation gap. There's a gap between their education levels, their sense of what they desire in the world, their desire to participate in the social systems of their country, and their inability to do so. They're reminded of it over and over and over again. And all of these forces, these relatively educated middle-class people, radicalize along armed lines. So whereas the same groups of people 10 years, 15 years prior, from Mossadegh's time to 63 or so, are calling for still working within the constitutional idiom, calling for participatory politics, calling for party politics. And really remember that the Tudeh party had never called for the overthrow of the government, even at the height of its power in the 1940s and 50s, was still talking about participatory politics. By the mid-1960s, there are increased calls for armed rebellion, armed revolution. And this is a global phenomenon as well, right, that Iranian students and revolutionaries are tapping into. It cannot be, I think, overstated how important it is that in the, radicalization process of these young dissidents, that there is no avenue for them to sort of be part of politics in Iran. But it also can't be overstated that the global context really, really matters, right? The fact of eventually the Cuban Revolution, the fact of the sort of public prominence of Brazilian guerrillas, of Che Guevara, of Ho Chi Minh, of the Vietnamese movement. These are the new kind of revolutionary models that are available to Iranians. And they're really attractive to these young Iranians in part because both China and the Soviet Union are playing nice with the Shah. And so the earlier models of sort of communist revolution or the even in the aftermath of the Sino-Soviet split, Iranians are like, well, a lot of the Iranian left, young Iranian left, is in a position where they're discussing the fact that both China and the Soviet Union are selling arms to the Shah or basically having diplomatic and economic relationships with him. So maybe the most famed theorist of the leftist guerrillas in the early 1970s, Bijan Jazani, writes about this, about the fact that there are important revolutionary figures. They need to know the Russian revolutionaries and they need to know the Chinese revolutionaries and they need to engage with those theories, but that those governments are not actually in a position where they're helping the Iranian revolutionaries whatsoever. And so they need to sort of look to other models. That's where things like Algeria, Vietnam, Palestine, Cuba, etc. come in. And revolutionaries travel to those places to train with these armed guerrillas. So the radicalization that I'm talking about happens both because of the contradictions born of the domestic context, economically for the working classes and also sort of politically for the rising middle classes, and also of the new political context born of the post-Sino-Soviet split and these new revolutionary movements across the global South.
So yeah, as you mentioned in your question, we do see this sort of unparalleled kind of rural urban migration, proletarianization, influx of peasants into the cities. We see, as Golnar was kind of very eloquently kind of laying out, the emergence of this modern middle class, really, who were beneficiaries of this system, but then had considerable demands on it, which the regime could not meet. But I'd say there's another angle to this as well, insofar as this passive revolution of the Shah and this increased both personalization of power and centralization of power through the sort of modern bureaucratic state, but obviously twinned with this deep sort of micromanaging, highly personalistic form of rule, basically destroys all of the former kind of buffers and intermediary sort of classes and elements, social forces that could deflect responsibility and blame on the Shah. So with the White Revolution, we see in many ways, while we do see actually a consolidation of forms of agribusiness and so on, often by actually favored elements of the court and maybe landed families as well, we also do see actually many of these sort of big landed families who, when push came to shove, against sort of the Red Terror or the Red Menace or whatever, would ultimately link hands with the Shah. Many of them are actually quite alienated and, again, not willing to intervene. And many of them are their power and social power is also very considerably eroded. We also see this in terms of the disenchantment of the traditional clergy, in large part because, their role in the judicial system, Sharia courts, the educational system has been, again, massively eroded, if not like pretty much neutralized. So there's a sort of long-standing, this very kind of powerful religious social force in Iran, sort of an institution which goes all the way back to the 16th century. And obviously it's had its ups and downs and whatnot, but nevertheless, it has been a consistent force. And when we spoke about the Tobacco Revolt, we spoke about the Constitutional Revolution. And so the clergy has been an important force, but then increasingly disenchanted, disillusioned. Either they're outright hostile to the Shah or they're quietist. And there are elements too, which are very much aligned with the Shah's regime, but they are increasingly a minority. Overwhelmingly, there is a silent kind of majority, as well as a very much engaged, politicized element, which is increasingly Islamist. Then there's also obviously the Bazaar, which has this long-standing, again, relationship with the clergy, what we say the traditional middle class versus this new middle class, which has emerged in the Pahlavi period, which again very much feels both threatened and disrespected and devalued by the Pahlavi regime, which very much favored, the Bazaar does not fit in with this project of modernization. It's seen as antiquated. It's seen as actually betraying a past which the Shah and the Pahlavis would rather forget. So, and if we recall, back in both in the Tobacco Revolt and the Constitutional Revolution, the clergy's kind of check on the clergy and the Bazaar's check on the Shah's regime has been a consistent force. It's been a consistent role. And I would say sort of increasingly over the 60s and 70s, this is very much there as well, especially as the Shah came to, influence what was often called maybe a comprador bourgeoisie, foreign capital, or big business and big enterprises against mercantile interests, which, still overwhelmingly, had a real hold and grip on the retail industry in Iran. But they're very much angered and so on. And obviously this really comes to a head in around, in the late 70s, 77 and so on, where because of spiraling inflation, the Rastafari's party, the Resurgence Party, the one-party state, basically sends out various individuals to scrutinize prices and basically castigate and rebuke and fine bazaris, merchants who are charging too much or are seen as basically charging in excess of fixed prices. And this is really seen as sort of many ways the final nail of the coffin. This is where the kind of the fractious relationship between the bazaar and the Shah really just kind of, becomes irreparable, basically. So these are sort of long-term kind of structural kind of fissures and cleavages. And as I said, twinned with this personalization of power, where the Shah can no longer deflect. He can no longer defer to sympathetic clergymen. He can no longer defer to, have landlords, in a sense, big landholders, landowning families in their respective provinces, try and actually co-opt and actually and bring over opposition to his side and so on. And this is where actually the Shah increasingly, and obviously the Savak, which is seen as his tool, becomes seen as, and the royal family and the corruption and all these sorts of things which Golnar was talking about, they all become, in a sense, really focused on in the person of the Shah. I mean, all of these grievances, all of this anger becomes very much focused on his person, and he's really seen as to be the maker of this. But again, one thing I do want to stress, I think we did touch on it, but it is really important that with hindsight, obviously, that's the only other time we can really say, has a revolution happened, has it not, was a revolution successful or whatnot? And, as Golnar said at the very beginning of this question, we only have a sense of inevitability of it now, that the Shah was destined to fall. But in the period, I mean, he was riding high, really until 1977. And the very fact that he thought a one state party was a good idea, and the fact that he was so kind of arrogant and contemptuous of everybody and anyone who dared to think otherwise. I mean, he famously sort of said, if you're not going to join the Resurgence Party, then take your passports and leave. Anyone who doesn't is in essence a traitor. This is 1975. You've got to think this is like 2 years before it all begins to unravel. And the United States was very much, caught blindsided as well. This very much comes out when you're looking at sort of the discussions with the National Security Council of the Carter administration. They're just very much, blindsided. And they're like, we thought this was very much, it was part of obviously Nixon's twin pillar strategy in the region as well. And the Shah was very much portraying himself as the gendarme of the Persian Gulf. So it was very much kind of like a counter-revolutionary force in the Persian Gulf. He wanted to have this outsized role in the region. And this is also something we haven't actually mentioned. He was just spending inordinate amounts on predominantly American, but not only American, arms. And obviously a lot of this, of course, a fair amount, billions, was being sent on development, and this created all of these kind of contradictions, in the economic and political arenas. But he was spending a fortune on armaments, one of the highest per capita in the world. And Iran, I think, at the time of the revolution, had like the 5th biggest army in the world. I mean, this was very much part of, also portraying himself, again, trying to live up to his father's image as, this courageous soldier who, very much leader of the nation. And he would constantly, obviously, wear sort of military regalia. And again, this very much fits in with what we were saying before, that, this sort of proliferation of military coups by sort of radical nationalists throughout the Arab world. He was very much leading into that in a sense as well. But I mean, we can see sort of there's lots of things going on, as I said, like this personalization of power, trying to project power again beyond Iran into the broader region. Disillusionment with all of these sort of social forces, which, by 77, I mean, all of those links, those intermediary links, which would have allowed the monarchy to maybe manage crises, are very much severed. And there's this complete disillusionment and a rejection and repudiation of the Pahlavi system, so in toto.
Hi, this is Olufemi O. Taiwo, and you're listening to The Dig. You can support the podcast at patreon.com.
This episode of The Dig is brought to you by our listeners who support us at patreon.com and by University of California Press, which has loads of great titles, perfect for dig listeners like you. One that you might like is Under the Iron Heel, The Wobblies in the Capitalist War on Radical Workers by Ahmed White. Under the Iron Heel is a dramatic, deeply researched account of how legal repression and vigilantism brought down the Wobblies, and how the destruction of their union haunts us to this day. White documents the torrent of legal persecution and sometimes lethal violence that shattered the industrial workers of the world. Under the Iron Heel uncovers disturbing truths about the law, political repression, and the limits of free speech and association in class society. Under the Iron Heel by Ahmed White. Out now from University of California Press. Learn more at ucpress.edu. What was the balance of forces between Islamist and leftist forces in the revolution? And then to what extent can you neatly distinguish between the two? After all, a major, if not the principal intellectual influence on the Islamic Revolution was Ali Shariati Mazanani, who developed this fascinating synthesis between, on the one hand, third worldist, socialist, anti-imperialist politics, and then on the other, Shi'ism, which he reconceived as a faith of popular struggle. What was that balance of forces, and to what degree were the two forces intermeshed?
Yeah, this is a really important question, Dan, and honestly one that is a matter of significant debate among historians, in part because there's different historiographical traditions. Of course, if you are in the Islamic Republic, part of the kind of official narrative, the left is negligible. It comes into the story only as kind of a traitorous force. So it's very much seen as a not only Islamist, but clerical revolution. And I want to really, start to disaggregate between some of these different things. Just as there are different forces of leftists, there are different forces of Islamists as well. The figure that you point to, Ali Shariati, is himself emblematic of some of the major transformations that happen in Iran in the middle part of the century. He comes from a religious family, and his father is a sort of preacher in his own right, and a critic of the Pahlavi government, associated with a kind of precursor to these movements that emerge in the 60s and 70s called the God-worshipping socialists. So Shariati comes out of that tradition. He mostly is raised in Mashhad, but he's eventually educated in part in France, where he corresponds with Fanon, and he goes to protests on behalf of the Algerian Revolution, where he's engaging with all of these third worldist revolutionary figures. So he's a very different kind of figure. He has a very different kind of lineage than does Khomeini, whose lineage, while unconventional for a cleric in terms of his interests in mysticism and philosophy, but is nonetheless still part of the traditional seminary education that would be fitting of his class. So even among the Islamists, there's a split between lay Islamists, people who are considered kind of lay Islamists, and clerics. We see this in the guerrilla groups that emerge as well, where there are guerrillas who are basically professing a kind of eclectic mixture of basically an engagement with anti-colonial revolution and Marxism on the one hand, socialism on the one hand, and then a kind of revolutionary Shi'ism as maybe in part born out of the influence of Shariati on the other. So there are all of these different trends and tendencies that are percolating and circulating in the 1970s among students, among revolutionaries. Certainly among the student groups, there is a move towards revolutionary Marxism-Leninism as the major sort of broad trend among both students mostly among students outside of the country. But among students in the country, there are those who affiliate themselves sort of as a trend with the Mujahideen Khalq, who is this group of, as I said, kind of eclectic socialist Islamists. I mean, the Shah tries to disparage them as what he calls Marxist Muslims, but they disavow that kind of language, and they say, no, this is Shi'ism. Shi'ism is a revolutionary religious force. So all of this is percolating, right, in the 1970s, particularly after this huge event in the political and revolutionary imaginary of these young Iranians. And that is when in February of 1971, there is the first kind of broadly publicized guerrilla action when a number of Marxist revolutionaries who are part of the group that is going to be sort of popularly known as the Fedayeen, they storm a gendarmerie post in a northern village by the name of Siyah-Kal. Their effort is a total failure at the level of a sort of military operation. They are not successful. They are eventually killed. But it becomes a big kind of public relations triumph for the new generation of revolutionaries who are very much eager to dissociate themselves with what they see as the malaise that has overtaken the Iranian opposition in the aftermath of 1963. They see the Tudeh and National Front as kind of caught in a never-ending cycle of quietism and self-recrimination and malaise and an inability to think out of the paradigm of parliamentary politics, which is clearly a dead end at this point in their view. And they start theorizing the necessity for armed revolution. There's several different tendencies within the Marxist Fedayeen that we can go into in more detail if you want. I'm kind of giving a broad strokes of some of the different forces. So certainly revolutionary Marxism-Leninism, particularly influenced by Cuban Revolution, by the Palestinian movement, by the Vietnam, and then also this Shariatian new Shi'ism, revolutionary Shi'ism. And Shariati is very keen on saying that this is not a rethinking of Shi'ism, but in fact, it is the reactionary, quietist, apolitical members of the clergy who have sort of wrestled the true meaning of Islam away from this kind of its orientation towards social justice and towards equality. You know, the idea of the Imam Ali as the kind of first socialist, the first person invested totally in a classless, just society, right? So Shariati is really important because he rethinks all of these concepts. He re-imbues these words and terms from long-standing Shia tradition and imbues them with this new revolutionary fervor. And this is very influential on this group, particularly on these groups of young people based in cities whose families and who maybe themselves had been displaced from provincial contexts in which they had their families had been for since they knew, and then had recently been displaced into the cities and were kind of part of this new urban milieu that was in some cases unfamiliar or alienating for them, right? So the majority of the people who, there is some mixtures, but the majority of the people who sort of fall into the leftist camps tend to have come from families that were already part of the sort of modernizing middle classes, secularist middle classes, in some cases already had liberal or leftist families that they're raised in. The Mujahideen, the sort of Shariati and post-Shariati world might have come from families, religious families, but nonetheless they're now in cities. They're gaining sort of new educations outside of the sort of traditional seminary structures. So all of this is part of the world of the revolutionary milieu that's building in the 1970s. But I want to emphasize that all of this could have happened, all of these intellectuals, all of this political movements, all of this could have happened without a revolution, right? There are I don't want to think too teleologically from 1970, 71, 72, or from Shariati, the moment of Shariati's popularity to the final fall of the Shah. Because a lot has to happen from 77 to 79 for the Shah's government to finally collapse. So all of this could have happened, I think, without the final success of a revolutionary movement. There would have been a revolutionary movement, but maybe not final success of one. And in fact, the guerrilla groups, the leftists and the Fedayeen and the Mujahideen are crushed throughout the 1970s. They're decimated, and they are not at the forefront of the revolutionary upheaval in 78, 79. They're not the ones who are sort of leading the movement to its final success, although they're very important actually in some of the armed confrontations with the Pahlavi government in the final months of the Pahlavi government. I don't want to underemphasize them either. But my point is that the Shah remains quite fixated in particular on the threat of communism. So from his first days in power until his last days in power, he is viciously confronting all signs of what he sees as communist possibility in the country. And there are networks of revolutionaries that are utterly decimated. I mean, hundreds of guerrillas are killed or imprisoned over the course of just a handful of years. Most of the leadership of these groups is killed or imprisoned. That doesn't mean that they don't have a lot of influence, but their influence remains largely limited to universities and university students, and then fellow travelers and readers who might be kind of engaging with those revolutionary thoughts. But their influence is both massive in the sense of everyone knows about them. They are really emphasizing to ordinary people how brutal Savak is. They are showing that dissent is possible. This is one of the things that the armed insurrectionists, the armed guerrillas talk about, is wanting to show cracks in the system of the Shah, to show that the Shah is not omnipotent. And in this sense, they're extraordinarily successful. They link all of these global revolutionary trends to what's happening in Iran. They have readings of the political violence of Savak where they link it to other, what they call neo-fascist governments all over the world and reactionary governments all over the world. And this becomes part of the kind of ether in which political thought is swimming in the 1970s. But at a functional and sort of practical level, their groups are decimated by 1977. So at the moment that the cracks really start to show in the Shah's government, they're not the guerrilla groups are not positioned in such a way as to take advantage of those cracks in the same way that the clerical networks, which are repressed, and of course there are many clerics who are imprisoned, but they are not the clerical networks, and the sort of networks of seminaries and younger seminarians is not sort of attacked with quite the same virulence as the guerrilla groups. So this produces something of an imbalance in terms of which members of the broader revolutionary coalition are best positioned for leadership. Having said that, the revolution, until well into the fall, after the fall of the revolutionary forces, there are all sorts of leftist revolutionaries who are all over the world are going back to Iran thinking this is the success of their movement. Throughout 1979, after the sort of establishment of the Islamic Republic, it's the era that is called the springtime of the revolution, and it's a kind of open space, an open forum for all of these different revolutionary groups to be debating their all sorts of minutiae. I mean, I don't want to go too much into the sectariana of this time, because in fact there is just an enormous amount of sectarianized, different political sects and different kind of splits between different groups of leftists and Islamists. But that kind of gives you, I think, a lay of the land politically. And now I am very eager to hear Eskandar's response as well.
No, I mean, you covered everything. You covered a lot.
Yeah. I meant to be briefer, but you know how it is. It's like you start talking, you remember 20 other things.
The one thing I would emphasize a little bit more would be the importance of, going back to the Second, Third National Fronts and the repression of those, and the repression of groups such as the Liberation Movement of Iran, out of which the People's Mujahideen, young people who were somehow associated with that, who went to the Hedayat Mosque where Ayatollah Talabani used to speak, and basically he famously wrote a book called Ownership in Islam, where he basically reprises, there's lots of other things which one could say is problematic, but he actually reprises the famous line from Marx's critique of the Gotha program, from each according to his ability, from each according to his needs. So basically you see at this period throughout the sort of 60s, and obviously before that you see with people like Mohammad Nakhshab, the founder and leader of the God-worshipping socialists. Yeah, very much a kind of a dialogue, I think, as Golnar kind of very dexterously laid out, sort of conversations between those who were religiously inclined, socialists, those who were more secularly inclined, you might say, and often having quite vibrant conversations in this regard. And at the same time, you obviously had Islamist forces who really felt threatened by the likes of the the Tudeh party and religious forces. And actually, you'll when you go through the memoirs and hear them speak about this period, what they say is that the Marxists had like an answer for everything. They had an answer on art. They had a position on art. They had a position on the economy. They had a position on politics. They had a position on literature. They had a position on all these sorts of things. And it's very much in the mold you can see of sort of, particularly sort of a certain version of dialectical materialism was influenced by Soviet Marxism. So Islamists very much see themselves as needing a program to compete with the Marxists, who were both very well organized, ideologically disciplined, so on and so forth. And anyway, so as a result of this, as Golnar laid out, I mean, there's lots of different hues of religious forces, some Islamists, some I would say not necessarily Islamists, and then Marxists of all descriptions, like we have the revolutionary organization of the Tudeh party, which comes out in the mid-60s, which is very much Maoist influence, and it's coming out of the Confederation of Iranian Students Abroad. But yeah, the Fadayan, I think, is a particularly interesting and notable one insofar as it actually comes out of various regional circles. So there's the Jazanizi Zarifi circle, and again, these are both activists in the National Front. I mean, Bijan Jazani is interesting because he comes out of the youth organization of the Tudeh party, and he had family connections to the Tudeh party, but he was very much active in the Second National Front, as is Hassan Zia Zarifi, sort of amongst students, and was very much kind of at the forefront of the student movement of the National Front. And then you have another group in Mashhad, which is the Pouyan Ahmadzadeh circle. And they're very interesting as well. They're from Mashhad, which is obviously northeastern provincial city, but they were like reading Regis Debray. They were accessing copies of Monthly Review. So they are, like, as Golnar said, very much trying to follow global developments. There is an internationalist consciousness which is percolating, which is growing and becoming ever more vibrant. And I think, like, both outside the country in the form of the Confederation of the Iranian Students, but also inside the country, very much so. And they're very, very aware. The thing I actually wanted to stress, and I got kind of lost on a tangent there, but the thing that they wanted to stress was the kind of the political dead end, which Golnar also spoke to, but they are literally kind of really grappling with this. And I think, like, this isn't just simply them theorizing it. It's like they're very aware that actually organizing in factories, connecting with workers, let alone contesting, forget contesting elections, all these sorts of things have been absolutely expressly prohibited by the Shah's regime, and actually trying to do so meets with a guaranteed sort of prison sentence and possibly torture and all these sorts of things. So they very, very sort of expressly theorize this dead end and think that armed struggle as a form of kind of revolutionary praxis is the only way forward. And sort of the subtitle of Amir Parviz Pouyan's famous tract is kind of a rejection of the theory of survival, which they identify with the Tudeh party. So the Tudeh party is simply just trying to survive, and they're still, in a sense, wedded to kind of a reformist program. No, armed struggle is the only thing that kind of, in a sense, can show the regime to show that it's not impervious. But I just thought it was important to show, on the one hand, that it was initially, these various different groups who had come to a certain political alignment or political commitments independently of one another, who still had significant disagreements, but then by 71 have, in a sense, have put these to one side, that this was very much in dialogue with sort of global lexicons of armed resistance. And actually, the individual who led the Siarkal operation, this attack on this gendarmerie in Iran, was Ali Akbar Safai Farahani, who had actually traveled to the Palestinian camps to receive armed training at the hands of the PLO. So they had actually, they were very much following what was going on globally in internationalist fashion, and actually were trying to learn from sort of fellow revolutionaries, not simply just by reading their books, like reading Debray or reading Che Guevara, but actually going and making contacts with guerrillas in the Jordanian camps, it would have been at this time most likely. And also with respect to the Mujahideen, we see a number of their militants actually going to Oman to participate and support the various Marxist-Leninist groups in Dhofar, basically fighting against and trying to overthrow the Sultan in Oman. So we do see kind of like lots of these kind of militant opposition groups actually going abroad, and actually some of them then would go subsequently to Lebanon. They would actually participate in sort of struggles actually against the Israelis following the beginning of the Lebanese civil war, and actually begin to receive training. And it was sort of both sort of religious nationalists, but also some of those who would go on to establish the Revolutionary Guards following the revolution. So it's kind of like sort of, in a sense, the lexicon of armed struggle, it kind of encompassed a broad range of people, both sort of Marxist-Leninists, of various hues, Maoists of certain description, sort of religious nationalists, Islamists, pro-Khomeini forces. I mean, there were very many sort of who sort of laying claim to this kind of language as a kind of as a way to legitimate their own struggle, their role in the struggle. Also, there was often a competition of how many people actually died as a result, of how many martyrs you gave to the struggle. This is very much a kind of the dominant frame. But what I wanted to stress is that a lot of these actually come out of the National Front, actually, or somehow associated with the National, or try to actually sort of find a role in the National Front. And then when that sort of is a dead end, they are increasingly radicalized. Some of them did have more radical politics, some less so. But that kind of sort of impasse is, I think, absolutely decisive. And I think it's important to say that it begins in the early 60s, from the mid 60s, really, because it's not a matter of the guerrillas simply deciding, oh, yes, we're going to adopt armed struggle, and then the Shah sort of brutally kind of repressing in response to that. The reason why the armed struggle emerges is because of the degree of repression which preceded that. But I would say that post-71, the level of repression does increase significantly, and the brutality of the Savak also does increase markedly. And that was in response to the guerrilla struggle. But I would also say that the guerrillas were actually quite aware that by launching kind of guerrilla struggle, that the regime would basically respond with absolute sort of with dramatic and sort of really kind of severe violence, and that it would become increasingly very much more repressive. So they were very much aware of this, and that was actually part of the idea that the true nature of this regime, which was a repressive, dependent capitalist dictatorship, we would actually by engaging in armed struggle, we would be exposing what is really essential to this regime. And really kind of the increased repression was simply just an intensification of what it really was, what this regime was. And then when the regime finally was kind of compelled to slightly kind of liberalize and open up, this would then create conditions in which there could be a mass mobilization against it, as people were even more alienated, more frustrated, more angered by the kind of the conduct of the regime and how it policed the shutdown dissent. So I would say, well, on the face of it, Siakal was very much unsuccessful, quote unquote. In some sense, that kind of theory, you could say it does make sense. And you could say, in a sense, that what happened in 77 subsequently did kind of play out as some of them had actually foreseen it would play out. But going back to your original question way back when about the balance of forces, I mean, the Islamists were definitely not repressed in a way in which the leftists were. The leftists were absolutely decapitated. I mean, the Tudeh from sort of the late 50s onwards, I mean, post-53, but then the late 50s completely. And really, many of their leading lights were all basically living in East Germany for decades, completely kind of detached from realities on the ground. Whereas many of the leading lights of the Fada'i guerrillas were either executed or killed in actually fighting the security forces, or they were actually imprisoned and tortured to death, as Ahmadzadeh was. So in sum, I mean, one thing that really does help explain the balance of forces by the time you reach the revolution is that, on the one hand, while Islamist forces, particularly those sort of in the more traditional sort of sectors of society, or those associated with the clergy, the bazaar, the network of mosques, Hosseiniers, while many were sort of traditionalist and apolitical, there was still very much a network in effect. And actually, Khomeini, before he leaves the country, was very kind of, he wasn't only just wasn't only like an intellectual and a religious figure. He actually was a quite strong organizer in this respect, and had many lieutenants that he delegated kind of authority to inside the country to basically to build up this network of support amongst all this religious infrastructure of mosques, Hosseinias, where Shia Muslims mourn the Prophet, throughout the entirety of the country, whereas the left, from the Tudeh party, including the Mujahideen, these sort of this lay Islamist group, as well as the Fada'i guerrillas and so on and so forth, really they were either completely decapitated and then sent into exile, or the leading cadres who turned to armed struggle, they were predominantly killed or in jail or executed in jail on occasion. So, I think this actually is really, really important just to stress, because that also just explains a lot of the reasons why the left had weak organizational capacity by the time we hit sort of 1977, 78, and following the amnesty and release of prisoners.
You both laid out how the repression of the left empowered Khomeini and the Islamists to play a dominant role in the revolutionary process. But how then did they ultimately seize absolute control over the revolutionary government and violently repress their revolutionary rivals as the revolution shifted into the provisional Islamic revolutionary government and then to the Islamic Republic? Why were they the party that won out, and how did they do it?
So as we've been saying, the Islamists in many ways were in a stronger position. They were very much primed and already mobilized. But I do think that there are various reasons and various explanations for why the Islamists were ultimately able to sort of outmaneuver their rivals. So I would say on the one hand that Khomeini's kind of brand of Islamism, a kind of, you could say, Islamic sort of populism, where he co-opted many sort of elements of the left's agenda on the surface of it. So talking about the Mossadegh, so the oppressed, as opposed to like the working class. So he basically very much took over the lexicon language of Marxism, some sort of key words, and then reprised them in a Quranic sort of lexicon. So he very much talked about radical redistribution. He talked about sort of free gas. He talked about sort of very much a lot of the elements and inequalities of the present order will absolutely be dissipated, will be completely eradicated. But in terms of, they were also, as I've been trying to say, very kind of organizationally savvy, very, very capable. And this was obviously because, by the time of the revolution, many of the secular forces also had, in a sense, bowed to Khomeini's leadership. They didn't necessarily know, exactly what he had in store or the political order he had in mind, but they couldn't deny his preeminent role by virtue of his sort of religious status as a kind of an ayatollah, a marja taqlid, someone that Shia Muslims actually whose their legal rulings imitate. The fact that his role in the struggle, the bravery he had been showing for the last 15 years against the Shah's regime and denouncing it. So his position was very, very clear. And many of the secular forces, such as the National Front, such as the Liberation Movement of Iran, had basically accepted his authority as sort of the leader of the revolution. And he absolutely capitalized on this. So once he actually returns to Iran in February of 1979, he basically initiates a system of dual power, really, or a parallel form of government to parallel that of the provisional government of Mehdi Bazargan, who is appointed prime minister, who he also appoints and sets up. Because on the one hand, the clergy needed these kind of educated, you could say respectable technocrats who had some knowledge of government and government administration. But at the same time, he creates a parallel system. So he sets up, for instance, a revolutionary council who he appoints all of the members. And they really are making many of the major day-to-day policy decisions in this period. Also in the course of the revolution, we see the sprouting up of, flurry, sort of burgeoning kind of committees where people sort of, the revolution committees taking control of streets, neighborhoods, while, as order in a sense has started to dissolve and a new order is being established. We see all of these sort of committees, sort of burgeoning throughout the country. And it does take a little bit of time, but gradually the Islamists sort of put their imprint on all of these committees and steadily take kind of control on them. We also see the constitution of the Islamic Republic Party. They don't have 2020 vision, and they're not clairvoyant, and they don't have really a clear idea that they'll be able to impose their vision of the Islamic State. They're still very much in this process of struggling and seeing, how much support and grassroots support they actually have. But very much this is the ideologically at this point they do have this line, but they're just not sure whether they can actually realize it. We also see a kind of a paramilitary component here, where out of these sort of militias Islamist militias, which had kind of spontaneously emerged in various parts of the country, actually, and acknowledged Khomeini as the sort of preeminent leader. They steadily begin to emerge and form what is later called as the Pasdaran, or the sort of the guardians of the revolution, the Revolutionary Guards. And we also see other groups, so like the Mujahideen Organization of the Islamic Revolution, this is sort of like taking its name, or basically taking the name of the Mujahideen to try and delegitimize the People's Mujahideen, which is seen as kind of very ambivalent on the question of clerical leadership, and very much saying, we are committed to Khomeini's leadership here, and mobilizing to neutralize and ultimately decapitate the threat which they believed was posed by the Mujahideen. So just in short, what we see very quickly, all of the actors here are really trying to figure what the heck is going on. Khomeini himself doesn't have quite an idea of what he's ultimately going to be able to achieve here, but he's very intuitive. He has this like really kind of strong popular sensibility of where and how he can actually move people towards and his agenda, while at the same time, instituting in a very kind of systematic and considered fashion this kind of parallel system of government to consolidate the Islamists, the pro-Khomeini Islamists hold on the state.
Brilliant. Golnar?
Yeah, Essie touched on a lot of the really important points. I think this is honestly a hard question to answer in brief, and it has a lot of different avenues that you can look at. I think one of the important things to consider is just the last several months before the fall of the Shah in 1978 and 70. Well, the Shah leaves the country in January of 1979, and the year before that had been marked by protests and escalating mass protests that were, in some sense, their conceptual universe was drawn from this revolutionary Shia Islam that we might say had some of its most popular and most popularizing form in the thought of Ali Shariati. But of course, Khomeini himself was also a master of this, of sort of rethinking terms and ideas drawn from revolutionary leftisms and putting them into Shia idiom. But the revolution itself temporarily kind of starts to happen on a Shia clock. Beginning in January of 1978, one of the main newspapers in Iran, the sort of state-run newspapers, publishes this piece that is basically an anti-ulama, anti-Khomeini piece. It accuses Khomeini of being a former British spy, of working with communists, of working with the British, of writing erotic poetry. And it also accuses, again, in the language that is first kind of circulating in the time of the White Revolution, accuses the ulama of being part of Black reaction. So if the White Revolution pits itself against Red Revolution, it also pits itself against what it calls Black reaction, and the ulama represent part of that. But it uses that language again, and this is just incenses Khomeini supporters. Protests erupt in Qom, the seminaries are closed, thousands of people take to the streets, and there's basically the government responds in force, and there's a massacre. And this sets off a series of protests marking every 40 days after that initial set of that initial massacre. We're seeing that timeline again, where we just marked the 40th day after the Islamic Republic killed Mahsa Amini. The 40th day after a loved one's death is a moment of mourning for Muslims. So this was very masterfully politicized as a way that protesters could know when the protests were happening without having to communicate in channels that might be compromised, right? So this is a way that everyone can just know what the next protest is without having to think about security culture. There are several protests. This continues to escalate. More people are killed. Another 40 days. More people are killed. Another 40-day protest happens. And this, again, I think kind of conceptually marks something about the nature of Khomeini's leadership, about the Islamicity of this movement. And the Shah eventually, manages through the sort of repression of this movement to even alienate moderates among the clerics, most prominently a figure by the name of Shariat Madari, Ayatollah Shariat Madari, who's really an opponent of Khomeini in many ways, and a more moderate figure. But after some of the worst of the government repression in the aftermath of this event in September, which is called Black Friday, where the government really turns its forces against protesters, including helicopters shooting down at people. Just hundreds of people are injured and killed. Even Shariat-Madari says the leader of this revolution is Khomeini. So there's consolidation among even these opposing clerical factions, right? That may have at an earlier point in 76 or 77, if the Shah had instantiated an effort to sort of make peace with those people, might have been able to curtail some of the radicalizing among young seminary students. Of course, that might not have also, we can do what ifs, but we don't know. There's also these huge strikes among industrial workers, among oil refinery workers. And again, this is a big part of the lead up to the revolution. But Khomeini himself is from exile. He is in a position to speak very freely on and to really exhort revolutionaries to go back out onto the streets. At one point, it actually looks like the moderating factions might have a chance. In the early part of the summer of 78, Shariat-Madari says, okay, well, we should go home and start to have conversations about how to make the Shah do what he promises, which is kind of liberalize further. And Khomeini says, no, let's keep protesting. But people don't mark the next 40th day. So for a moment, it seems like, the prime minister at the time says, oh, the crisis is over, we can all move on. It's through more repression and eventually, as I said, Black Friday, that even these moderating influences within the clerical classes are like, no, in fact, Khomeini's the leader, the absolute undisputed leader of this movement. There's too much momentum. He's too popular among ordinary people. He's popular among the seminary students. And they're pushed by their own, by the more radical younger students in the seminaries who are pushing these more moderate or more apolitical or more sort of conciliatory forces among the higher ranking clergy. They're kind of swept up in this pressure. Similarly, I think we cannot overemphasize the legacy and the memory of the 1953 coup, which, at least at the moment, the first several months after the fall of the Shah and the coming to power of the Islamic Republic in February of 79, there is real worry about another coup. This is what leads in part to students, Islamist students who are calling themselves the students in the line of the Imam, to occupy the American embassy in November of 1979 and eventually sort of keep it occupied for the next 444 days. And again, there are those forces who are calling for some kind of compromise. The people in the provisional government under Boroujerdi, in fact, resign when Khomeini puts his support with the hostage takers, with the embassy occupying students. But they are sort of overwhelmed by the liberal Muslim faction under Boroujerdi, and the provisional government is overwhelmed by the sort of revolutionary mood of the time, which is not in the mood for conciliation. I think it's also the memory of 53 is important in the sense that at the very end, the Shah appoints a figure by the name of Shapur Bakhtiyar, who had been a part of the National Front and had come out of the Mossadegh tradition. Of course, he's booted from the front for working with the Shah because, again, no one's in the mood for conciliation at this point. Revolution is pretty much the goal, overwhelmingly. But so the Shah attempts to appoint Bakhtiyar, and Khomeini, when he comes back, appoints Boroujerdi, who himself had been a veteran of the Mossadegh political coalition, albeit on the Muslim, of the Muslim nationalists who are sort of allying themselves with Mossadegh. And I think you see something about the continued both political legitimacy conferred on these figures by their association with Mossadegh, and the idea that legitimacy, that was the last moment of political legitimacy, is attempted to be kind of used by both the new Khomeinist faction and the Shah's sort of last-ditch efforts to stay in power. So I think that Khomeini at this moment, he's sort of stating that he's going to go to Qom and not be part of politics and so forth. But as even in 1970, he had been giving speeches about the concept of the guardianship of the jurist and the Islamic government. So it's not as though he just thought of those things like in late 1979. He had been thinking about those things. But, the debate about this is whether he was biding his time, whether he didn't think that it would be popular, that he had the popular standing to kind of move forward with this, whether he thought, okay, we'll work with the Islamist technocrats like Bouzergan and the members of the liberation movement, or, exactly what the sort of the conceptualization at this moment was. But in 1979, there's very much this revolutionary mood across different sectors of society. Even when Khomeini tells striking workers to go home, in some cases they don't. So there's just this the first time that there is an effort at taking the American embassy happens just a few days after the success of the revolution, and initially those people are sent home. In November, when it happens again, Khomeini gives his explicit support, and he uses it as a way to sort of clean the government of the more liberalizing forces among the sort of Islamic coalition. So pretty much at every point, there is some degree of Khomeini simply outmaneuvering his opponents. Part of it is the institutional support power of the mosque networks that Eskandar noted. Part of it is the ways in which the legacy of 1953 plays out. We see this even in this big March 8th protest for this big International Women's Day protest that happens after Khomeini announces that women have to wear the veil to places of work. There's this huge protest of mostly women, Women's Day protest against it. And he sort of walks it back in the aftermath of several days of protests. There's real disagreement even among the leftists and liberals about what to do about this protest. I mean, most of the protesters are themselves leftists and liberals. They're women who are part of those movements. But there's real hand-wringing about the necessity to have a kind of unified front against imperialism, against the potential for another coup. And you see in this moment real fissure about how to approach questions like that. And sort of even among the leftists, a dissatisfaction or a suspicion of the liberal Muslim camp that is exemplified by Bouzergan, because they saw him as somebody who was going to try to take a conciliatory posture to the U.S. or, work within the kind of imperialist framework. So that 1953 legacy plays out in a lot of really important ways here.
What was Khomeini's concept of clerical rule or rule of the Islamic jurist? Just how novel was it given the quietist and monarchist history of the Iranian clergy? And then what role did a particular gender order play in Khomeini's theory of Islamic rule?
So the concept, the notion of the guardianship of the Islamic jurist isn't an entirely new one. It's actually not new in Shia jurisprudence, but it had a very limited parameters. So it really gave supervision, a clergyman, supervision over orphans, those who were incapacitated in some way. And that was actually, generally speaking, the remit of this sort of the velayat faqih, the guardianship of the jurist. It's in the 19th century. I mean, there are earlier kind of iterations of this, but we could say perhaps it's best known in the 19th century, where a particular clergyman by the name of Mullah Ahmad Naraghi tries to carve out a kind of almost like an executive political role for the clergy. But I would say this is still a very marginal idea. So actually the leading kind of Shia authorities throughout, the 19th century actually had a very kind of restrictive understanding of the clergy's political remit and role. It didn't have this political tenor to it whatsoever. But Khomeini obviously has this series, when he's in exile in Najaf in southern Iraq, he gives a series of lectures on this sort of the guardianship of the Islamic jurist, and it's actually just a series of lectures. It wasn't actually initially a tract, but it is subsequently published in Beirut and other places as a tract, as almost a manifesto for clerical rule. And in that book, he gives a number of possibilities. He doesn't say that a single cleric should necessarily rule. He also gives the sort of possibility of almost like a council of clergymen ruling. And one of the things that's actually interesting when you sort of put it in a larger kind of history and clerical criticisms and debates of this idea, actually a lot of clerics actually don't think it has any grounding in Jafari, like Shia jurisprudence, actually. And I think this is why earlier I wanted to kind of point to Khomeini's quite heterodox education and socialization in a sense, because the fact that he was very much grounded in Neoplatonic philosophy, I think you could make a strong case that his kind of guardianship of the jurists sort of say is very much akin to the Platonic, almost like philosopher king, because I mean the basic argument, very basically put, is Sharia law. In order to execute Sharia law, you have to have a state. Sharia law, basically, in a sense, you're leaving a huge part of Sharia law in abeyance unless you have a state and executing certain Islamic edicts in this way. But then the question is, like, who interprets the law? Who is the interpreter? That's like the key kind of question. Who is interpreting, in a sense, what God's will is in the form of the Sharia? And that's obviously the clergy. They are the ones who, by virtue of their knowledge of the law, Islamic law, are entitled to have this right. And it's almost like he often refers to it in terms of almost like an obligation to rule and lead the ummah, the Muslim community, to live in accordance and in the image of God's will. Even when you look at actually the way in which he argues it, it's very much in the form of something almost like a syllogistic argument. So if we want to execute Islamic law, then we need an Islamic state. Who interprets the law? It is the clergy. Therefore, we need the clergy to rule the Islamic state. And this is sort of the structure of the argument. And then he goes on to actually substantiate it and such. But, it's actually quite, in terms of based on hadith, so basically the sayings and deeds of the Prophet and the imams and the companions and so on, it's actually very weak in that regard. And a lot of actually Shia clergymen have argued that this actually comes out of Sunni modernism, this argument, and it's adapted. And actually one thing that's also just another side point, and I will actually truly end here, that he might have been reading people like Rashid Reda and sort of various sort of early sort of Sunni modernists and proto-Islamists, you could say. And then his sort of the younger cohort of clergymen were also very much part of this broader global kind of Islamist conversation. So Ayatollah Khamenei, who's now the current supreme leader, was reading and translating Islamist ideologues like Sayyid Qutb, the Egyptian radical Islamist, who turns up in any sort of history of quote jihadism or Islamist radicalism. He's sort of seen as sort of the godfather. So they were very much reading people like Qutb, Maududi in Pakistan, and so on. But Khomeini, he's I think this when we want to understand the guardianship of the jurists, I think probably the Platonic philosopher kings is a good analogy, but it's like the Islamist kind of iteration of that.
Wow, that is fascinating.
An interesting thing is that Shariati, in his life in the early 70s, when some of the clerics whom he's criticizing criticize him back, they call him a crypto-Sunni, too, for some...
Wahhabi, too.
Yeah, a Wahhabi, exactly. That he is bringing these kind of traditions and ways of thinking about Islam that are not indigenous to Shiism, to Iranian Shiism, into the conversation and confusing listeners. Yeah.
I did not know that. That all really blew my mind. What role did a particular gender order play in Khomeini's theory of the rule of the Islamic jurist? And what role did that gender order play in the popular reception of Khomeini's politics?
Yeah. So in the conceptualization of the guardianship of the jurist, I mean, it's very clearly an entirely patriarchal male concept of who is going to be part of not only who is the jurist who will have sort of final guardianship. And as Eskandar mentioned, Khomeini himself flirted with the idea of a group of jurists. Even at the time of the sort of debates about the constitution, there are some who believe in the velayat faqih but think it should be more than one person. So there are different sort of iterations of how this might look. Of course, it's assumed that it will be a man, because what's imagined as the preconditions for being able to enjoy this status is, you have to have a very high-ranking status and be a marja taglid, a source of emulation, and have a sort of gone through the process of gaining the highest status of jurisprudential knowledge. And this was a male field. So on the very, very basic level, yeah, this is it's very clear that there is a gendered dynamic here, that in the unelected parts of the government, including the jurist, including what eventually is these unelected bodies that we can talk more about when we're talking about the post-revolutionary government, that these are all going to be high-ranking clerics, and high-ranking clerics are by definition men. At the same time, there are certain new or novel conceptualizations of revolutionary womanhood that Khomeini absolutely plays with and emphasizes and talks about. He recognizes and discusses directly the role of women as part of the revolutionary upheaval. This is also of a piece, in a sense, with other revolutionary Muslim thinkers, including Shariati, who had sort of conceptualized a new Islamic woman in the tradition or in the image of these extremely important women in the Shia tradition, particularly Fatima. So Khomeini takes that discourse up to some extent. And there are, of course, it's extremely important. We didn't talk about this when we were talking about the guerrillas, but in all of these different new revolutionary political parties, revolutionary guerrilla organizations, revolutionary sort of groups that are emerging in the 78, 79 moment, women are a big part of all of those different groups. On the Islamist side, on the leftist side, among the liberals, on the industrial strikes, there's women in leadership, important positions across the board here. So women see themselves as part of the revolution. And I mentioned before that, there isn't really a serious kind of conversation about rolling back the women's right to vote. And I think that you see, in a way, the engagement of women in the revolutionary process is tacitly or explicitly, in some cases, understood as a part of the revolutionary upheaval that brings Khomeini to power by Khomeini himself, insofar as he is not talking about rolling back certain women's rights. At the same time, this is an extremely gendered vision of the world. Right away, he tries to mandate veiling in places of work and government buildings. He says that women should no longer be going into their work naked. That's the language he uses. After which there is, as I said, this big March 8th rally, which makes Khomeini sort of, at least momentarily, walk back this veiling edict. It takes some time to impose this new sort of gendered physical space, gendered public space. From conversations I've had with older Iranians, depending on where they were, in province, in a city where they worked, if it was a government job or not, there's plenty of indication that women weren't all made to veil. The sort of veiling edict didn't fully sort of take hold across the country until even 82, 83 in some cases. So this is not a overnight process of sort of disenfranchising women who had become part of the political process. But there is clearly the small group of revolutionary clerics who are, by definition, they don't include women, and women who are in judiciary roles and so forth lose their jobs, immediately as the judiciary structure, the government attempts to clericalize it, take out all of the secular jurists and put in clerics, Shia clerics. That also takes several years. So part of the question is that it unfolds over time in a way that makes it so that at different moments, different snapshots of moments will give you a different view of what is happening in terms of gender. But there is still evidence that there are at least some women in the Islamic Republic who support the government, right? So we have to continue to think about other kinds of nexus of social difference. So your relationship to the government as a woman might be different if you're, in terms of class, ethnic minorities versus ethnic minorities. It's of course true that the major clerical figures in the small revolutionary council that Khomeini appoints are all, obviously, they're clerics and they're men, but they're also all from Persian-speaking backgrounds. That's something that we talk about a little bit less because it's not, I think, immediately visible to people outside of the country who is, because we're, in here we might hear everything in translation. But the handful of the main people who are, or I should say, the main people who are Khomeini's lieutenants, I'm thinking of Motahari, Beheshti, Khamenei, Rafsanjani, they're from Persian-speaking backgrounds. And so your vision of gender would also have to take into account a kind of robust understanding of social difference and power, including things like ethnic background, class, region. So there is right away an uprising in Iranian Kurdistan, and that includes Kurdish women. But their uprising is as as Kurdish women, emphasizing all of that. And in fact, some of the few communities that we know voted against the referendum for the Islamic Republic were some of the ethnic, in the Kurdish region, there was not widespread support, even though those people are Muslim too, right? So all of these different sort of components of social difference go into the way in which people conceptualize themselves as part of the government. So on the one hand, you have definitely a new conceptualization of revolutionary womanhood. On the other hand, you have a completely patriarchal government structure as imagined and then eventually put into place by the Islamic Republic. And then, I've run out of hands, but then you also have the sheer fact of women as part of the political process that is something that you can't put back into the bottle once it's out. And the social programs enacted by the Islamic Republic, including continued sort of emphasis on social welfare, health, access to healthcare, access to literacy. These are programs that help some women sort of improve their quality of life, even as the government is otherwise repressing women in terms of their ability to be part of public life.
Kind of building on what you were saying, emphasizing it was this question of state feminism in a sense. So obviously with the revolution, a whole sort of array of demands in a sense resurfacing after years and years of repression, and Kurdish demands for political and cultural autonomy, a parliament of their own, and so on, and basically speaking to an agenda for decentralization, because as we've been speaking about, the Pahlavi project was, and the Islamic Republic consequently built on this, it's very much about centralization, expanding the central state, and so on. So we see Kurdish demands very much calling for cultural autonomy, reviving many of the demands which we saw in the Mahabad Republic of 1946. We see the return to the national scene, like key figures like Abdurrahman Qasimlu, who was very much a Kurdish socialist. He was the head of the Kurdish Democratic Party of Iran. We see figures like Sheikh Izzuddin Hosseini, who was a very kind of outspoken, critical cleric, who were very, very clear that they were going to push for cultural autonomy within the broad bounds of a democratic Iran. And actually, the key slogan of Qasimlu was, democracy for Iran, autonomy for Kurdistan. But very, very quickly, we see kind of conflict emerge from March of 79. So if you think the revolution happens in February, literally within a couple of weeks, we see conflict between the Peshmerga in Kurdistan in places like Mahabad and Sanandaj, which, is very quickly repressed by the central government, by the emerging revolutionary guards. It's also where we see in sort of really infamous individuals like Sadeghi-Boroujerdi, the infamous hanging judge who would go on to execute scores and scores and scores of Kurdish activists and militants. There are various attempts in this period by the provisional government to try and mediate. Like Golnar was saying, the Kurds, along with a number of left-wing groups, actually reject the referendum because they understand it. There's sort of this call for an Islamic Republic. Are you for it? Are you for, basically, or are you not? As being, in a sense, consolidating a sort of a Shia, Persian-centric, clerically led order, which they very, very kind of viscerally understand is going to be detrimental to their interests. So in response to that referendum, which happens in April 79, they say, no referendum, self-determination. And again, this then unleashes a new period of bloody repression. So I think this is just really important just to stress, even though I'm not doing full justice to it, that both the Kurdish question, the Kurdish national question, is immediately, very early, within a month of the revolution, we see it being repressed. And also the question of women, where we see the sort of the mandatory hijab being kind of steadily imposed by stealth and intimidation and terror in Tehran and other major cities and elsewhere. So these two, sort of both the Kurdish national question and women, are kind of bellwethers of the shape and the course that the revolutionary consolidation of the Islamist sort of order is going to take.
That was part 3 of my interview with Eskandar Sadeghi-Boroujerdi and Golnar Nikpour. Stay tuned as our last episode on the history of modern Iran is released over the coming week. Eskandar Sadeghi-Boroujerdi is a professor of contemporary politics and modern history of the Middle East at Goldsmiths College, University of London, and the author of Revolution and Its Discontents, Political Thought and Reform in Iran. Golnar Nikpour is a professor of history at Dartmouth College with an interest in histories of law, incarceration, and rights in modern Iran, and is currently finishing her first book project, A History of Iranian Prisons and Carcerality in a Global Context. Thank you for listening to The Dig from Jacobin Magazine. As Marx once said, after noting that anybody who knows anything about history knows that great social changes are impossible without the feminine ferment. While other podcasts have only interpreted the world in various ways, our point is to change it. We're posting new episodes every week. The Dig was produced by Alex Lewis and recorded at WBRU in Providence. Music by Jeffrey Brodsky. But this episode was edited by Liza Yeager and Mitchell Johnson. Our communications coordinators are Tamuz Frankel and Sylvia Atwood. Our senior advisors are Thea Rio-Francos and Ben Mabey. A really big thanks to Nushin Samimi and Sarah Hassani for helping out so much preparing this series. And also to Eskandar and Golnar. Putting this whole thing together has been a very, very collaborative operation. Thank you. Check out our vast archives at thedigradio.com. Follow us on Twitter at thedigradio, and please find us wherever you get podcasts and subscribe. If it's on iTunes, please also leave us a nice review. Those reviews help introduce us to new listeners. But what really and truly does that is you telling people you know to listen to the podcast. Please make propaganda for us. And do find us at patreon.com and make a monthly contribution to keep this operation up and running strong. Even a few bucks a month is huge.